We know who we are, we're a big bright spark. We know how to take the lead and we aren't afraid. Shake up all the rules, pretend like they were never made. You know it's real, and something that you really feel. Down in the bottom of your heart down to the beat of your feet, marching to the drum. Break all of the rules, pretend like they weren't made for you. You know it's real when something that you really feel down in the bottom of your heart. It's undeniable. We're undeniable. Leave all of the rest behind. We know that it's really inside. Deep down in the bottom of our hearts, we're undeniable. Taking it all in, we're in the same thing. We do it all together, together. Taking it all in, we're in the same thing. We do it all better together. Shake up all the rules, pretend like they were never made. You know it's real when something that you really feel down in the bottom of your heart. It's undeniable. We're undeniable. Leave all of the rest behind. We know that it's really inside.
Welcome back to Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Latin America. At this time, please take your seats and silence your mobile devices. Our program will resume shortly. Welcome back to Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Latin America. At this time, please take your seats and silence your mobile devices. Our program will resume shortly. Please welcome Alexander Tombini, Chief Representative, BIS Office for the Americas, Richard Biles, Governor of the Bank of Jamaica, and Bloomberg's Sherry An.
Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. What an exciting time, isn't it? Especially because of the topic of this panel at a time when we had really Terra USD collapsing, a meltdown really in the crypto world. So this really raises key questions for not only crypto assets, but stable coins, and of course, the closest analog to stable coins, perhaps central bank digital currency. So what a great time to have you both here. Thank you so much for joining us here in Panama City. Should I start with Alexander? Let me just start with everything that's happening around the world right now as we see this huge collapse, lots of volatility even today. Will this whole meltdown have consequences broader than just the crypto world, especially when it comes to perhaps a threat to the financial system itself?
Well, I think the crypto world has grown very much in the last few years. 2021 was a big year for crypto, stable coins and unbacked crypto assets. And what we have seen recently first has to do with tighter global financial conditions, right? Unlike promise made earlier that this was like a hedge for inflation or something like digital gold, some of these cryptocurrencies, it's like any other asset and has been affected by global financial conditions. So implications for the broader economy, I think this is an area which has a lot of momentum trading that we have seen in 2021, supported by easy global financial conditions, and now we are seeing the reverse. The market was close to $3 trillion in November 2021. Now it's more like closer to $1 trillion. So there's a lot of wealth that has been destroyed in this process. This, of course, has implications for the economy, but it was growing and has very important features that
But are the implications as dangerous as being an actual threat?
Well, right now we have seen a reduction to a third, almost a third of what it was in the hypes of November 2021. And here's one more asset, of course. Assets in the world are north of $100 trillion. So we're talking about so $2 trillion in this process. Yeah, it's meaningful. And but we'll see. There are some features which are important in this market that can be emulated by other initiatives.
What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a big crypto fan, neither personally nor as a central banker. Currency for me has to be stable, and cryptos, because they are traded, means that they have a lot of volatility in it, so we stay far away from cryptocurrencies.
Does it raise the case for an actual central bank digital currency, which is what Jamaica has done?
Well, a central bank digital currency, say in Jamaica, serves our domestic market. It's intended to stay within our borders, not to go beyond that. Once you step outside of the borders of a country, you have to deal with regulations of AML and CFT, and that's a whole different world because everybody wants to know who is sending the money and who is receiving the money internationally. And it's all part of what happened after 9/11, right? So in the borders of Jamaica or any other country, we can develop a central bank digital currency that allows persons to send money person to person, person to business easily. But once we step outside of the border, we run into all of those regulations.
Does the instability that we're seeing in crypto assets, just because of how perhaps people who are interested in those assets are also interested in digital currencies, does that raise the threat given that this is proliferating just so fast?
Well, I think people who are interested in cryptocurrencies are really cross-border traders. While central bank digital currencies, so far at least, have been within a country's borders. So I think a lot of persons are interested in how can I move money from one country to another swiftly outside of the banking community. But for central bank digital currency, we don't have those problems internally.
Alexander, tell us a little bit about the state of CBDCs at the moment, globally, how interested central banks are. And if, as Richard says, it's mostly to look at it through the lens of domestic payments.
Well, each country has a different idea, but the overall picture from our survey using data up to the end of 2021 is that 90% of central banks surveyed are engaged in one form or other of CBDCs, right? With respect to crypto, the growing market of crypto in 2021, this was said by 60% of our surveyed central banks to be a motivation to prioritize CBDC. The pandemic also, which has incentivized contactless payments, has also been a factor for 30% of the survey. So there is a lot of engagement. I mean, you're talking about this, what's happening with the crypto market. I think that will be further motivation for developing further CBDCs by the central bank community.
In Jamaica, we have a national program of trying to digitize the economy. So whether it has to do with payment services, it has to do with government services, has to do with paying taxes, paying fees, national identification, we want to digitize all of that. And the intention is to make doing business much easier, more efficient, and more quick. Central bank digital currencies have a lot of advantages locally. They're secure, they're very fast, and they tend to be more inclusive, bring people into the banking community, people that stay outside of the banking system because of inefficiencies, because of the cost to do with transactions in the banks.
But one of the biggest benefits, especially when it comes to reducing costs, for example, is to actually be able to, as you said, send money with less costs overseas as well. So why would Jamaicans choose CBDCs over, say, other crypto assets?
No, you can't use CBDC and send money abroad. Let me say again, our borders, once you step beyond the borders of a country, you run into regulations, laws that have to do with money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. So you have to be mindful of who is sending the money and who is the money coming from. So the banks, if I'm sending money to you in New York, your bank in New York is interested in who am I, and my bank in Jamaica is interested in who are you, to make sure that we're clean and that we're not part of any terrorist network or any money laundering network. And that's where the banks play a big role. And they use their system, which is called SWIFT, to move money from me to you. Now that SWIFT system, as its name suggests, is quite swift, but it does have bank charges that are attached to it. And I think that's what people want to get away from, a lot of those charges that are involved with moving from bank to bank.
Also, the reason that perhaps some of these people are using crypto assets is the idea of democratization of finance, right? Alexander, what are the risks associated to that? And perhaps how does CBDCs compare in the way, as Richard just mentioned, about more safety, transparency as well?
Yeah, just to go back to the cross-border issue, I think in this survey, central banks are increasingly thinking about CBDC as facilitating cross-border. All the problems that Governor Biles just mentioned are there, but they talk about two specific ones: operating hours and long chains of correspondent banking that you can reduce using interoperable CBDCs. But CBDC is a stable digital currency, right? It will be stable in the sense that it's issued by the central bank. There is a central bank which will implement monetary policy to make things stable, different from the other means of payment, supposedly, like the stable coins.
Right.
So in this sense, yes, it can have the features of the digital, the crypto, or the stable coins, programmability, composability, which are the new features of digital money, but with a liability of the central bank. So you have a centralized, trusted party, if I may say, that will be issuing this digital asset and not, as we see, stable coins today.
And then Richard was talking about all of the benefits and positives of being more transparent and being able to track all of these payments through CBDCs and central banks backing. But I wonder, what are both of your thoughts when it comes to ideas where authorities can actually have too much information and privacy is an issue? Last year, for example, the PBOC was talking about anonymous wallets, and all of a sudden when it became about larger payments, they wanted a valid ID. But how do you ensure that that transparency is actually used for good?
Well, in Jamaica, with central bank digital currency, we at the central bank won't know who is doing what transaction. The commercial bank, if they are requested to, and we can talk about that in a minute, they can trace where every transaction came from and where it went. Now, to do that, in our case, for example, you need a court order. So somebody would have to get authorization from the courts to say, let me go and look for the transaction that John Brown did on the 14th of September 2021. And that can be traced. And that's one of the big advantages of digital currencies. But normally it would be quite anonymous because we're trying to make cash as much as possible free to use and anonymous. And only in exceptional circumstances would we break that anonymity.
Yeah, there is the hybrid system, which is the central bank just record the wholesale, the net value of the payment service providers, banks and non-banks. So, and then the personal information, the transaction at the personal level is at the banks and at other payment service providers. So as the governor said, I mean, only in democracies where the rule of law is there, and then you have checks and balance, institutional checks and balance, you can only go to who is behind the pseudonymous with a court order,
Right.
like bank deposits today in most of democracies that we know. So there is no difference in this respect.
And I would like to remind our audience to submit any questions you might have through the Bloomberg New Economy app. I really wonder also, what about the costs of not only CBDCs, but crypto assets as well, and this ensuing chaos that we're seeing for commercial banks as well? Because I know that Jamaica, for example, you tended to go through intermediary banks where you would not necessarily distribute JAMDEX, but actually use commercial banks.
Right.
What led you to that decision?
Well, I think there are different systems for central bank digital currency. Either we would go straight to the consumer and give them an account at the central bank, or we go through the commercial banks. Commercial banks have hundreds of thousands of customers already. So why would a central bank want to recreate that distribution network? All the merchants are customers of the commercial banks too, and we want to encourage private enterprise anyway. So we chose to go through the commercial banks. Now, because central bank digital currency is free to use and the banks can't attach a fee to it, there's a little bit of reluctance to embrace it and to take it to market. And so we have to be very encouraging to them to take it to the consumer and to take it to the merchants. But I think that what they're looking to do is to wrap that CBDC in a wallet where they can offer many other financial services, and on that basis distribute it to their customers. So I'm looking forward to the near future when those wallets will become public and will become interoperable and begin to gain momentum.
If I may ask a follow-up on how the rollout of JAMDEX is going right now. I know that it's a pilot program, but we've seen other economies, especially in LATAM, like Ecuador, who released a dinero electrónico years back. They stopped because it wasn't really being that popular among the public. What are you seeing?
Right, so we're still in the pilot stage, and I therefore can't comment as to how popular it would be. But, I mean, you know, once we have the banks in support of it, I think it's not a hard thing for the consumer to be won over, because they're all using phones already. In fact, the number of phones in Jamaica outnumber the number of people. So everybody is au fait with how to use the phone, and to move currency around with a phone would be second nature to them.
Alexander, just going back to the idea of disintermediation of commercial banks and perhaps some of the risks posed by all of these crypto assets and CBDCs just competing with the traditional financial system. What are your thoughts?
Well, depending on how you design the CBDC, of course, central banks are fully aware of these potential consequences. So if the CBDC will pay interest, then it will compete directly with bank deposits. So the transmission mechanism of monetary policy will be faster as far as deposit rates are concerned, okay? But what we see is that central banks in general are looking CBDC as a complement for cash. So it should be a footprint which it resembles the footprint of cash, which on average is around 10% of the means of payment. So yeah, I mean, I think the community is fully aware. There are sort of measures to mitigate potential disintermediation, like limits, like not paying interest rate. If you pay interest rate, you pay less than the deposits at the commercial bank. So there are many.
But that's an interesting data point that you mentioned. 10%, cash represents 10% of money. In Jamaica, it's 22%. And what that means is that we are a highly cash-driven economy. And cash is very expensive for us to mint it and to distribute it, very expensive for the banks to hold it and distribute it, very expensive for every single businessman to take the cash, secure it, transport it. So CBDC offers a massive opportunity to take that cost out of all levels of that system.
But aren't there other costs involved for CBDC? Security, for example. How do you stop hackers from really infiltrating your system as well?
Well, that is a cost that we at the central bank have undertaken, and we have had international companies ensure that we are as secure as possible. So we will accept that cost. And I can tell you, that is a tiny fraction of the cost of printing and distributing cash.
I would say this is pertains to the electronic payments in general, not CBDC in particular. Of course, CBDC being a claim on the central bank, then we have the reputational, potential reputation implications. So I think this issue of cybersecurity and security of information related to CBDC is an important issue, but it's not different from what we have today with digital payments in general and electronic transactions in particular, but it's the fact that it's, at the end is a claim on the central bank.
If we have eventually more, as you mentioned, interoperability between CBDCs of global central banks, Alexander, do you think we'll get to that point in the future, years from now, where we could actually see this compete with the global monetary system and perhaps a dollar-denominated one?
Well, I mean, the reserve currency status has to do with many things. Rule of law, the strength of institutions, and especially liquid markets. So if you don't have a liquid market, even if you have the best technology, you will not develop a reserve currency. So I think these other issues are much more important. Technology can help, can facilitate trade. We talked about long corresponding banking chains can be reduced. Operating hours can be 24/7. But at the end of the day, it depends on the willingness of countries to work together to make their system interoperable. Of course, the issuing central bank, if it's a reserve currency one, will have to authorize the holdings by non-residents for this to be, say, substitute currencies around the world. So there are...
Richard, do you see that in the future for Jamaica at some point?
Well, you know, if I want to send money now, US dollars, I can. It's out of my US dollar account in Jamaica, send it to anyone, anywhere in the world. I don't need a digital currency to do it. I mean, the transfer of money today is digital already. It's just that it has to go through the banking system. And I think that's where a lot of people have a problem. It's a little time consuming and it costs, but it's the safest way to protect us against the money laundering and the terrorist financing.
The idea, though, right now is with the proliferation of CBDCs, especially if you have this coordinated action among global central banks, that perhaps you could have any currency in the world have that exorbitant privilege that the dollar has. Do you envision a world like that at some point?
No, I think if you think of it, and if we were the world, everybody in here, the entire world, whoever has the most trade with each other, they have the best opportunity to have the international currency. And whoever has the deepest liquidity, the same thing. So I think that the countries that have the largest share of trade and who have a currency that has a track record and who has a currency with liquidity, they have the best opportunity to make that currency digital. And I know that the United States, the Treasury, not the Fed so much, is discussing e-money. And e-money is going to look very much like a digital currency that is international. And I think that we'll see that in the next year or so, piloted by the US.
Alexander, what do you think? And also perhaps adding to those thoughts by Richard, what about the geopolitical angle to this question? Because of course we have, as you mentioned, the US Treasury also headed towards that direction, but the Chinese digital yuan is now really being pushed.
Yes.
Right, I think for this cross-border integration, you have to have the will, right? If the geopolitical situation changes and you have more fragmentation, you also have fragmentation in the payment system, international payment system, right? So at the end of the day, regarding the status of a currency, I think it has to do with the size of the economy, trade, as Governor Bio said, and the depth of your financial system, because nobody holds currency. People hold asset denominated in currencies. If you don't have a large economy, a large financial sector, a large generation of high-quality assets, you will not dominate the world as a international reserve currency or the reserve currency of the world. So it has to do with other things. Technology, being disintegration, of course, geopolitics affects it. It makes the world more fragmented, so less willingness to integrate some areas. But you can have regional integration being accelerated with these digital currencies.
Richard, just finally, we have seen this huge uptake of CBDCs, especially in Latin America, whether it's crypto assets or CBDCs. Why is that, and will we see more of it?
Well, one of the reasons in Jamaica that I think it will be successful is that if we have 70% of the persons of Jamaica have bank accounts, but many of them don't use it because of the fees and because of the inconvenience. And what a digital currency will do for them, as in the rest of Latin America, I presume, is give them the freedom to move money around very efficiently without touching the banks. And I think that is a big impetus for persons.
Just convenience and
Yes.
us being very lazy
Efficient.
about everything, right?
Very efficient.
The drive for digitization. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Please welcome Alfonso de los Rios, co-founder and CEO, Nowports, Ricardo Vázquez Morales, Panama Canal Authority Administrator, Sandra Campos, CEO and board member, Shoulder Up Technology Acquisition Corp., and Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde.
You here in reality, good afternoon, all of you here virtually, good afternoon to this wonderful panel. I want to really supercharge everyone right here, right now. I hope you've all just had a little dose of caffeine. I hope you're all feeling excited about perhaps an alcoholically caffeinated beverage a little bit later, and getting together and talking in real time about some of the amazing opportunities, but also some of the headwinds and the challenges that really Panama finds itself in the middle of right now. I love the fact that this entire panel is based on supercharging supply chains, because that is what we are hoping to see occur by some of the relentless headwinds that we've seen put upon this global economy. Now, before we have got questions for the audience, we have got an ability for you to give me your questions to these fine panelists. But before I start asking your opinions on certain things, let's start first and foremost with just a little bit of a viewpoint from each of you as where we are in the supply chain headwind situation. So Kanti, first and foremost, with your bird's eye perspective on the 101 ships that currently sit outside that we can see from this beautiful hotel. Are the supply chain headwinds getting better at this moment?
Well, there are some challenges that we still have to see resolved, especially lockdowns in China. Once the manufacturing stabilizes in China, then we will see a smoother flow of goods and services moving through the different shipping lines and through the Panama Canal. What you see now is about 80 vessels on the average waiting to transit, which is about 2.5 days of transit through the canal. And we have peaked at about 140 at one point in time earlier this year. So the fact that we are about 100 vessels now waiting for transit is an indication that the lockdown has had an impact, and it's being reflected now with some delays in the volumes going through the Panama Canal, particularly on manufactured products. I think products going the other way, especially energy products, have remained very strong, exception being made of liquefied natural gas, which some of the exports from the United States are going nowadays to Europe. But other things being equal, we expect that situation in China to be resolved probably over the next quarter, and then just on time for Christmas shopping in North America.
Alfonso, from the technology perspective and from ensuring that some of these supply chain bottlenecks are a little bit greased, is that occurring from your perspective? And how much are we relying on technology to ease some of the logjams we've had?
For sure. I think on a big way, technology is helping importers and exporters to predict on a better way their whole supply chain, right? Not only the movement of goods, but actually the how do they order new products from the other side of the world. We're seeing some restrictions specifically in a big part of Asia, which is a good partner for all of Latin America, right? And restrictions are on the production side. So it's difficult to move some cargo, mainly from China to Latin America countries, including Panama, Mexico, etc. And technology can help importers or producers in Latin America have more visibility or real-time accuracy of what's happening in the other side of the world in terms of space in the vessels and obviously prices, which has gone up the last 24 months.
Sandra, from your perspective as, well, an advisor to many building a business, a woman who has run international retail, acclaimed retail houses that we know and are familiar with, do you feel that it's getting easier on the entrepreneurs trying to navigate these waters right now?
Well, I'll say one thing. For sure, supply chain is still at the top of the conversation. Yeah. And obviously, there's a lot that goes into that from the beginning of the process, product development-wise, to the end in terms of last mile. But I think that there's, in some ways, we've gotten better, and there are things that are more manageable, and that's because it's not a shock anymore. It's not a surprise now.
We've got more patient.
The prices are there. They're building them into the forecast. The margins are lower because of it. So that's one part. The second part is that we've been forced to really look at diversification of our supply chain overall and our sourcing opportunities, whether, wherever that might be, Southeast Asia, certainly Latin America, where the opportunity lies now. That has become a bigger priority overall, but it is absolutely still the number one topic. It is the number one opportunity, and what Alfonso was saying in terms of traceability, blockchain being there from a technology standpoint to be able to help, that's something that consumers are actually demanding. They're demanding to know where the product is. They're wanting it to be real-time, same-day, next-day delivery, so they're forcing a lot of these changes and a lot of the investments that the retailers are having to put on.
I love how you say it's top of mind and that the margins are now being built in. I mean, I don't know if anyone's caught some of the news today. Yeah. Target down 20%. Yesterday it was Walmart. This is having an implication in the forward-looking guidance of these businesses, how much it is eroding their margin, their profitability for companies that can't pass on these sorts of headwinds. And when we go into perhaps some of the opportunities we're about to see, I just want to test the audience for a moment. I'm very pleased that throughout this, I want you to basically be ignoring me and on your phones. I want you to be tweeting about what we're saying. I want you to be sharing it on LinkedIn. But I also want you now to be taking part in a poll, because we have got one for you. And what we want to know is, what is the most likely outcome for Latin America from the supply chain crisis? Now, is Latin America going to have a positive impact from the supply chain crisis? Is it going to be neutral, not going to really affect matters, or is it going to be negative? I'm going to let you fill in that poll. We're going to come back to your answer in a moment, but there we have some of the options A, B, and C for you. But Sandra, from your perspective, are we harnessing an opportunity right now? I loved it how we heard from Alfonso talking about a good partner being in China. Is Latin America being seen as a new partner for Europe, for the US, in terms of the supply chain, where to go and have things built, things sourced, things then shipped from?
In one word, yes. Absolutely. And there is an opportunity now. It does start with raw materials. It does, and certainly I come from the retail side, so as it relates to CPG goods and apparel products, footwear products, et cetera, they are, companies need to diversify. We need to have an easier transition from a language standpoint. There isn't the same language barrier that there is in China as well. So there's an easier transition there. Obviously, we're able to have nearshore opportunities, which really create being able to have a shorter lead time from a production standpoint. So that's another big opportunity here. The proximity, Mexico has obviously become a little bit more important and needs to become even more important to the US. In the US alone, while we would love to be able to say that we have domestic opportunity, we don't really. So we do need to continue to look at Latin American countries, Mexico, Peru, and every one of them right now has different expertise and different types of materials that they do better than others. But overall, there's an opportunity to do that much more. I will go back to one thing, though, in terms of that from an opportunity standpoint. I heard earlier in discussions today, it's the training piece. So the training component, I think, is going to be very important to be able to get a lot of manufacturing and a lot of the supply chain partnerships here trained to the level of the expectations for the US market. Because boards have very specific ESG and sustainability priorities, and right now more than half of the CEOs are looking at sustainability, so that really goes into everything from materials all the way through the employees and how they're being treated within all the different factories. And so there's a very complex line there, but yes, absolutely is an opportunity.
Katin, I know you've got views on whether or not this is being harnessed as an opportunity, but I'm interested in what you're seeing as from your perspective of just the shipping and the routes that they're using. Are we going to see nearshoring that much more here?
It's a possibility, definitely. It will depend on several factors. How efficient can we move products in and out from Panama, and how we can accommodate the infrastructure to serve that. That will be probably the largest challenge, because there are some limitations actually into that. We are not standing by ourselves. We have an edge because the flow goes through Panama.
Yes.
The issue is, can we unload and reload fast enough and efficiently enough to be competitive? Because already the cargoes are moving through Panama. Whether we can sidestep and provide products and reassemble products for Latin America, that will depend on how fast Latin America grows in order to generate the demand for these products. That's the natural hinterland to the Panama Canal will be essentially Latin America. When you move north of the Panama Canal, then it's more challenging. In spite of the fact that there is a larger market there, and there are more opportunities there, there's more competition serving that market. So new opportunities do arise in the Caribbean, elsewhere, near Mexico, which is closest to the end market. And we have to take a very strong step forward in order to be competitive and meet the demands of this market. The opportunity is there, the challenge is on our court, so we have to take the opportunity and run.
And Katin, just, of course, you are a man who's helming the Panama Canal, but you're also an economist. And also Panama Canal, I mean, from its very birth, I mean, its grand celebratory opening was delayed because of a world war. Do you think the here and now, we all get very used to the turn of phrase it being transitory, but is it? Are we seeing long-term shifts in routes and in the way in which Asia gets its energy, Europe gets its energy, and what that means for your business?
I think that we were going to move, if nearshoring becomes a reality, then the next stage for the Panama Canal will be to look into commodities. Either semi-manufactured products that will be reassembled to final destination, or then we have to trade on commodities. If we go commodities, then the capacity of the canal to price that commodity and to serve it is more limited than the possibility of pricing out a final manufactured product. An example, for a $20,000 automobile, we charge about $70 to transit the canal. So that is diluted in the end price. But when you take a ton of LNG or LPG and you charge the same equivalent amount, that becomes about $1 on million BTUs, for example, on a landed price. So we are gauging very narrowly, what is the added value the canal provides, and try to define on a product basis, what is the edge we have and where we can have more advantages. So even if we go to intermediate products or we go to commodities, then we have to understand what will be the end product and the end port of destination to make sure that we remain competitive. If we go manufacturing, then we have to be more competitive. We have to have a stronger infrastructure to supply just-in-time products with the right quality, with the right delivery time in order to meet market demand. And that is a truism, and we have to face it if we want to compete.
How's that infrastructure look to you, Alfonso?
No, I really have it's good. I really have a similar point of view in terms of that, and how just even patterns of consumption in Latin America are changing, right? We are seeing a big growth in terms of e-commerce, and there are different brands that are not only importing from one specific point or one specific brand, but actually from all the sides of the world, right? So one important thing I want to say is, I don't know exactly, and I think it's quite early to say if we are seeing long-term changes in terms of nearshoring or reshoring, but what we are definitely seeing from our side, mostly in the import and export side, it's a decentralization from the supplier side, right? When we're seeing that most of the supply chains in Latin America, approximately around 40% depended on China before the pandemic, we are seeing a change of maybe depending of other parts of Asia, but also of Latin America, right? We have big exporter countries like Brazil, like Mexico, that are exporting to the US for specific big industries like automotive, retail, manufacturing, etc. So I definitely agree that there are some fundamental changes. Still a little bit early in terms of long-term nearshoring, but definitely a decentralization of dependence on big nations, right?
Let's just get a sense of your optimism, or lack thereof, in the audience, and just see how our poll turned out. I don't know if we do indeed have the answers to that, and hopefully they'll be showing it in but a moment. There we have it. Well, good. None of you are negative. Absolutely zero. How nice. Positive, 48, but it's pretty mixed as to whether it's going to be neutral. Actually, more of you think that the gains in some areas are going to be cancelled out by losses in others. Others, 48% of you are a glass half full, kind of a joyous bunch. Exports are booming, nearshoring enables the region to capture the greater share of value, it would seem, so value-added production. It feels as though it's an investment question, it's about a harnessing of technology, and it's to maintain and make the most of some of these changes and potential for reshoring and nearshoring. Sandra, what technologies did you used to be growing? What technologies do you see now being adopted? What need to be more adopted right here, right now?
Well, there's definitely a lot of, even the last 2 years alone, I think there's going to be, $6 trillion worth of investment in supply chain technologies between now and 2025. So 2020, 2021 really brought a lot of those. One, for transparency, where are your goods? Where are they throughout the supply chain? Two, in terms of sustainability, to knowing where and how they're being manufactured. Because again, the consumers really demanded that information. So technology has definitely been playing an even greater part into it, and there are a lot of good options now. Certainly in terms of predicting inventory needs, that's one big one, because again, what happened with supply chain hiccups, we have seen that there's a lot of inventory out there now, because retailers went out and said, well, we need to buy that much more. So now we have a lot of inventory. They've had all these supply chain mishaps. And so with that, as you see from the results that have come out from a retailer standpoint, there have been lower reduced margins, there's a lot of inventory they have to sift through, so there's higher markdown rates.
Yeah.
So one thing impacts the other. So there's a lot now from a technology standpoint that's affecting each one of those. So whether that has to do with promotions, SaaS products are about promotions, loyalty programs, and how you can actually really acquire a customer and convert them faster, which again goes into reducing the inventory, which helps you predict what you need for the future. And then from a supply chain standpoint, order management systems, warehouse management systems that all integrate through blockchain, that are working to ensure that there's traceability and a lot of visibility across the board for real-time data. And I think those are going to be the most important changes that we have that we make. There's also the practicality of it and how much investment it takes, how much integration it takes from an IT standpoint, from the employees within an organization. There's a lot that goes into that too. So there's are we going to apply what we say we're going to apply, which there's an investment part of that, and it's time now that we're doing it, but we still have to wait to see what the results are going to be.
Talking of the investment that needs to go in, someone from the audience has indeed asked a question, and it's what you spoke to a little bit earlier, Alfonso, is the setting up of nearshoring operation requires relatively big investments and big risk. Is the mitigation of that just having, a diversified supply market? And that's something you're seeing, that people are just making sure that they have a far more diversified, resilient supply chain rather than just bring it closer to home?
For sure. I think there's a lot of things that we need to work on as a region in order to be like the #1 partner for other nations and other regions in terms of supply chain, right? Some of them, it's being an option on that decentralization. For example, we have some big textile producers in Mexico, big textile producers in Brazil, that can be an option B or option A compared to China, India, etc., right? So definitely being in the game, and I think that's why we are on a positive standpoint in terms of partners looking for Latin America. But we also need other things, right? We need help of great initiative like Panama Canal in terms of digitization of processes and having visibility of those processes in terms of documents, customs procedures, taxes, etc. So importers and exporters can have a better management of their own operations instead of depending on manual inputs, right? So that's a second thing, like it's decentralization. Second one, it's more visibility and transparency in processes. And the third one is just giving a better service, right? And service is in terms of quality. So we need to increase our level of quality in terms of products that we export, import, etc. But also digital tools, right? Giving for the importers in the US a way they can have visibility of our own production, of our own products that we're exporting, etc.
Particularly when so many investors and stakeholders of US companies that might be looking at this need an E, an S, and a G to be sort of factored into this.
That's the partnership part.
Yeah.
Because I think partnership is incredibly important, as you all are talking as well. It's just this, now Latin America becoming the opportunistic region to be able to focus on this, but it's about partnership and understanding that this is a two-sided street, right? The retailer, the manufacturer, the brand that you're manufacturing products for, they all have to be able to be profitable. Yes. So the stakes have changed now as well. So we have profitable businesses, we have to really focus on, and so the partnership aspect, I think, is going to be an important one for all sides to truly understand.
But overall demand is moving closer to the need of more sustainable products.
Yes.
Yes.
And if we look into more sustainable products, then we have an edge here, because compared to other manufacturing locations, if we move forward and leapfrog towards more sustainable products, sustainability will be part of the overall product branding of it, and that is going to be leading to opportunities that if we jump ahead, then we will have a chance to beat the market.
How's the Panama Canal ensuring that it's becoming as most environmentally friendly as it can, and how are you investing in yourself and ensuring that you're the partner of choice through all of this?
Well, it's been recognized that Panama has negative footprint as far as CO2 is concerned. Take the Panama Canal, we are positive, so we are moving to be carbon neutral by the end of the decade. By doing so, it gives an opportunity to price our services based on carbon emissions, which is something that we haven't done in the past. So it's not only that you praise the fact that you believe that carbon neutrality is important and the environment is important for the canal. Environment is everything, because we are rain dependent.
Yes.
And that being said, moving along the fact that we're going to be carbon neutral and we are very sensitive to the environmental issues and climate change, it's not only an opportunity to invest in order to improve our carbon footprint, but it's also an opportunity to price the service within that market, which is a new virgin market in the world and probably a new virgin market for the region. So I think the opportunity, a significant opportunity remains there to be grasped.
I think that's an excellent point, because obviously, as it being, I think more than half the CEOs are focusing on sustainability as their number one priority, but haven't actually put that into action. And knowing and acknowledging that and being aware of that Panama specifically, I don't know what this is, but Panama specifically has the edge on that, I think would be very important. So it's just awareness and making sure that that's translating to all the companies abroad. Yep.
Our microphone infrastructure is wavering every now and then, but we will leap to the rescue with a handheld if it does indeed cut out, so fear not. Alfonso, from your perspective, you talked about, to begin with, and I singled it out as a turn of phrase, but China's a good partner, Asia's a good partner. Do you think that the partnership, is there a even either or? Is it a mutually exclusive, or can we see that Latin America can still have a very close tie with China, can still receive investment from China, but become the alternative to China for a US-European consumer?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think when we talk about supply chains, not only in Latin America, but worldwide, the best way to think it's like not a black or white option, but actually having like different alternatives where we can depend on, right? So we've seen these last 24 months, different patterns in terms of dependency, right? As I said, and I don't want to be repetitive, but Latin America positioning itself on the textile industry and the automotive industry instead of China that was growing significantly in terms of electric vehicles, etc. So what I want to say there is, in general, I think it will not be one option or the other one, but a mix of just like different parts on different sides of the world, on a dependency on a decentralized supply chain, right?
Sandra, you can speak to entrepreneurship within this and also capital allocation. When you do start to see a world starting to worry about future growth, seeing inflation so rampant, thinking of interest rates that are going up, are people still wanting to invest in these sorts of solutions? Or is it more that the companies have to show that they are, you referenced it before, a growth company and not just a sort of revenue increasing company?
Well, I think there's both sides, and no matter what, it's going to be about being a growth company and growing profitably. So that the stakes have changed from an investment standpoint. That's one. The second part, though, is that everyone does know and believe that technology, no matter what, is going to make the change and is going to help every company out there, whether that's from a supply chain standpoint from the beginning or through the last mile. So the investments will continue to be there in those solutions, and those solutions are helping to save time, helping to ultimately save cost, helping to ultimately save operational expenses across the board. So that will help, in turn, improve the margins, which of course then helps your growth.
Katin, I know that there's a lot of investment going on at Panama Canal. Has any of the economic headwinds ever put that into doubt or thought about the overall return on that?
Well, we have a very high bar as far as what is the criteria to do investments. They are being focalized especially in supporting the existing infrastructure. Taking this infrastructure to the next level, it will demand significant technological investments in order to make it more on-time service, more reliable, maintain safety standards, and making sure that you deliver the product with the quality it is expected at the right time. That's one point. The second one is that if other opportunities do open up, we stand ready in order to, thank you, we stand ready in order to explore them. Especially if we look at commodities, for example. If there are products that we believe that we can transit without using water, so we move away from the waterway into the roadway, that will be an option that if we can do it efficiently and do transshipment through Panama. Panama has been a transshipment center for centuries. So it's new technology applied to an old concept. And we have excelled through 500 years doing that. So we have to take it to the next level. And that's what we are looking right now into which options are open to us that can complement airline connectivity, information connectivity, road connectivity, and how narrow the country is. If we got the water, yes, fine. But even if we do not have the water becomes a more expensive commodity that probably prices us out from market, then we have to look into options that probably rely a lot less on fresh water and try to maintain our position of reliability and service quality to the world.
Talking about pricing outside of the market or not, Alfonso, you've been sort of watching in amazement at how prices have changed of shipping, of supply chains, of cargo. What about pricing your own offerings and in this inflationary environment, how you manage that and your own people when they want to be being paid more?
Yeah, that's a good point. Before that, I will put a little bit of context. I think international investors, different venture capitalists, etc., have been investing on different parts of the supply chain in Latin America, right? Not only the first mile where I think Nowports is, the importing and exporting, but also last mile, right? We were talking just a few minutes ago about some last mile companies that have grown significantly in the region, Panama, Mexico, etc. They've been investing here because I think logistics and supply chain as a whole can be a supercharger for the economy development, right? When we talk about growth in countries, it depends heavily on trade agreements, on our capacity of production, etc. And that increasing our offering and giving a better service to companies can not only help Nowports grow or other companies grow, but actually the economy as a whole, right? Empowering medium and small exporters and importers to digitize their supply chain so they can give a better service to companies in the other side of the world, etc., can have a good outcome, right? So what I want to say that with that is, if we want to give a 10x service and grow and obviously grow Nowports at the same time, but also the economy, the only way to do it is to give a 10x service at the same price than traditional players, right? And we digitize all the process. We offer 100% digital tools so you can have visibility of your supply chain, but you pay the same than with a traditional freight forwarder or logistics company.
What are the risks of missing the 10x? What are the risks of the investment slowing into Mexico, into Brazil, where you're based at the moment? What could this region not do? What are the headwinds, do you think, to actually executing on what seems to be a very rich opportunity?
Yeah, obviously supply chain, it's really, really big. You know, like you can talk about a lot of parts, warehousing, last mile, etc. And the main risk of not executing that well is that we will never be able to be the option A for other parts of the region if we don't execute well on service, right? And logistics service, etc. So I think overall, you know, we are advancing on a good path, and it's a matter of time where not only Nowports, but other logistics companies, our digital logistics, can increase that level of service.
So, no, go ahead.
Two elements just to add to the answer. One is inclusion, whether we can grow depending just on our internal market, or we make a commitment to serve the world and go beyond. If you do that, then we have to make sure that we include the local population into the process.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to have an isolated operation that is geared towards the world with, you know, surroundings essentially not included in the flow of goods and services and the benefits thereof. And probably one of the elements that has demonized the fact of globalization is who was left behind.
Yes.
And making sure that everyone is carried on to the next level, it is important. Because unless we do that, then we have the examples of Brexit, the conflicts with China and US trade. All these elements just point out the fact that if you leave people behind, eventually, that is part of the investment in making a country more enclosed into the world economy and not isolated into something. Isolation comes in many shapes and flavors. And that lack of isolation is critical in order to become a part of the greater flow of trade and services.
Well said. The ex-finance minister coming in.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is that, you know, we had supply chain issues and challenges, and we were not where we needed to be before the pandemic, but that just highlighted the vulnerabilities that we have. But we have to remember that specifically as it relates to technology question, we're talking about now Gen Z as a consumer and Gen Z as an employee. Okay, Nowports, Alfonso is a great example of a Gen Z entrepreneur who's out there doing things that they believe in because they've grown up with technology. They know technology. So it's not just about our generation, it's also the next generation and what they're going to be doing. So we have to get up to speed, and we need to be able to implement technology into all aspects of supply chain.
And the transparency and the ethics that come
I
with all
agree.
of that.
Yes.
I agree. Partnerships is a big part of that.
Yes.
too.
What a great place to leave it. What a wonderful panel. I love to have this, well, food for thought of the inclusive capitalism that we need to see currently happening in Latin America. I want to thank you all so much, but please do give it up for Alfonso, of course, Katin, and Sandra.
Thank you.
What a wonderful set of voices. Thank you very much.
Please welcome Jorge Guajardo, former Mexican ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Ramón Martínez de la Guardia, Minister of Commerce and Industry, Republic of Panama, Vanessa Rubio Márquez, former Deputy Finance Minister, Mexico, and Bloomberg's David Papadopoulos.
Hello, hello. Welcome to populism. I guess this is why they chose Papadopoulos to do populism, I guess. We're going to start with Vanessa, the professor here of the group. She's going to actually, because the term is thrown around a lot, but Vanessa, tell us and tell the room, what is our working definition here of populism?
Well, there are several definitions on populism in terms of what the academic literature considers that. It can be an ideology, and it can be a thin or a thick ideology. A thin ideology is one that is more simple, that is basically very binary. It's us against you. It's the people against the elites. A thicker ideology would be one that has much depth into it and considers also a certain series of economic and social policies, but it can also be just rhetoric and discourse. That's another possibility of defining populism. And one other definition of populism, of course, is the one that is more sociological. So it's basically the people having a voice for the first time, the people being represented for the first time in terms of the general narrative and general politics. So basically that's the way populism it's defined, but of course we can talk about the various nuances and the trends.
So when we think about the populism here in Latin America and potential rise of it again to a certain extent, you believe that it's incredibly important to understand the broader global context of populism. Tell us a little bit about that.
I do. I think that Latin America is immersed in what's happening in the world, what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in India, what's happening in the United States. So one cannot understand the populist wave in Latin America without understanding that we are part of this wider context in which democracy is under debate, in which democracy is being contested, in which the liberal state is being contested, in which free trade, liberalism, and globalization is being contested. So yes, what is happening in Latin America has a lot to do with this wider context and with these wider international trends.
Very good. Now, Minister, I know Panama takes very seriously its efforts to keep populism at bay and to seek an approach that is going to last for years. How does Panama, and how do countries in general, vibrant democracies, avoid the trap of poverty begetting populism, begetting poverty, begetting populism?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you all for being here. For us, it's an honor to host this magnificent event. Panama basically has a steady growth in the past 20 years. We are the fastest growing country, but the interesting thing here is that we need to consider that that growth has social impact. And to me, to maintain democracy and not fall into the trap, you need to be very careful in allowing the citizens to participate. I'll give you an example. Last year, President Cortizo created a national pact called the Bicentennial Pact, where he invites citizens to propose ideas on the most difficult and sensitive issues like education, health, infrastructure. And those proposals were then reviewed by a committee, mostly from the private sector. And by doing that, the government committed to implement these actions, 187 of them. That is a great exercise of democracy. People feel that they are included, that their ideas count, and that they participate in the growth and development of the country. So,
is there a risk that something like that could take a populist route?
I don't think so. To me, if you give opportunities to your citizens, if you give them the capacity to participate, free speech, but also make them believe and feel that they are heard and that they are actually contributing to the solutions, and it's not only the government, that is more sustainable, because governments come and go, administrations come and go, but if you keep the private sector, the citizens involved, we have lesser risk of falling into the trap.
Now, Vanessa, I know that growth, economic growth and social justice is something that's very important to you related to this topic, right? I mean, something that you saw in your years, that challenge in Mexico, and how does one achieve those things? Because indeed, we've seen plenty of cases with spectacular growth, and it feels like, the population doesn't feel like they're a part of that.
I think one thing that when one understands populism and the way it's evolving, we are trapped in the populist universe. And in the populist universe, there's only binarism, there's only Manichaeism, there's only paradoxes. And we need to move away from that. And we need to create a sort of para-universe or an alternative universe in which we talk about these things, in which we talk about economic growth being a prerequisite for creating any kind of prosperity. There cannot be prosperity without economic growth. Where we can talk about climate change, when we can talk about the feminist wave in the world, where we can talk about all the different nuances and the shades of gray, and not to be constrained in that, again, populist universe in which it's only binary, only Manichaeism. And that's the only way in which we can create a different narrative and a different consensus around what is needed. And another thing is that populists have been very effective in pointing what needs to be done, in pointing the lacks of democracy, the lacks of the liberal state, the lacks of globalization, but they haven't delivered. And that will get into a certain point in which people, like the fact that the rhetoric was including them, but then what about me? What about deliveries? What about concrete deliveries? We want change, yes, but we want change for improvement. We want change for the better. So we need to make populists also accountable for delivering, which they haven't.
Right. Now, Jorge, change for the better the region has not seen the last couple of years. Of course, the pandemic hit it very hard, along with many other parts of the world, but Latin America in particular. I know that you see, somewhat related to this topic, a storm of sorts brewing. Tell us about it.
So let me just reframe sort of this conversation. And you started out by saying poverty leads to populism.
You can get into a vicious
I don't
cycle.
think that is necessarily the case. I think fear leads to populism.
Okay.
Polarization leads to populism. I mean, you've seen a populist wave in the United States, which is a wealthy country, and you have not seen a populist wave in the Dominican Republic, which is considerably poorer country. So I don't think we should just frame it in terms of poverty, therefore populist, or rich, therefore immune to populism.
Although you do have a half a century of stagnant income in the U.S. Right. Anyway.
I mean, yeah, populist leaders tend to impoverish their countries. That much is true. So you can assume that populism equates to poverty, but not that poverty leads to populism. So all this to say, what I'm concerned about right now, and we had this conversation before, is with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're already witnessing a rise in inflation, food insecurity, and these things usually lead to social unrest, which leads to migration. Not necessarily immediately in Latin America, but you can see waves of migration from Egypt or the Middle East countries, which depend greatly on Ukraine for food staples, into Europe. Now that's where the fear factor comes in. That's fear of the other. So that leads to waves of populism, which then tend to be contagious to other parts of the world, particularly in Latin America, as happened with the effect, for instance, with the MAGA movement, the Trump movement, which was in essence a populist movement that had contagion effects in Latin America.
Very good. So one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is on the migration issue. Is one of the other drivers that I think we're seeing to a certain extent, and it's also related to the global surge in inflation we're seeing, is in the pandemic, you had a country like the U.S. Spent fiscally 26% of GDP. The U.K., 19% of GDP. Germany, 15%. Vanessa, your native Mexico spent less than 1% of GDP.
0.7.
0.7 is the exact number. If 26 perhaps is too high, maybe it's part of the global inflation we're living, is 0.7 the right number?
Absolutely. The two outliers in Latin America were Brazil and Mexico. Brazil, close to 9% of GDP. Mexico, 0.7 of GDP. So by any count, that's way too low. And what does that mean? That meant that we had more death, we have more sick people, and we had more companies and SMEs suffering from COVID and from the crisis that resulted. So definitely that's low. But at the same time, what we need to know is that even prior to that, Mexico was not growing, no? When I stood up in Mexico and I wanted to be challenged by the new government, I said, okay, 2.2% is not the ideal, growth of a country like Mexico. Back then, the 15th largest economy in the world, out of 194 countries in the world, now the 16th largest economy in the world. But zero is much worse, and minus 3%, which is the mathematical average of the last 3 years, is even worse. So again, I go back to the point. Populists have been very effective at pointing out what the lacks are and what the shortages were of previous policies. But the problem is that they haven't delivered.
Right, so Vanessa, so if 0.7 was the wrong number, what would have the right number have been? And then if AMLO is a populist, as many would understand by your definition, don't you typically associate populism with massive fiscal spending?
One thing that I should have said at the beginning when you asked me about defining populism is that there's different ideologies within populism. So you can have right-wing populism, you can have left-wing populism, and a mix of
And which is AMLO?
It's in a mix. It's in a mix because I would say that he's very conservative fiscally because of what I just mentioned. The fact that Fitch just said that our rating was again supported today, it's basically a result of that because we have been fiscally conservative. But at the same time, we haven't been growing. We have been having more poor in the economy. We have been having less employment. And that is not sustainable. The fact that we're not growing is not sustainable. So yes, we have a mixture of all those ideologies within a very populist government.
I have a question for the minister, but Jorge, I saw you nod. Did you have something, you wanted to refute a point here?
No. I was listening to Vanessa and I was agreeing, but I would say to Vanessa's point, populism is not an ideology of the right or the left. Populism is a means of governance. It usually is a way to stay in power or get and stay in power regardless of whether you're from the right or the left. So I was nodding to Vanessa's point on that.
Very good. Excellent. All right. So, Minister, we're in Panama. I shouldn't put you on the spot, but I will put you on the spot a little bit. So, if Mexico did 0.7% of GDP during the pandemic, Panama did a little bit more. Now, again, I understand doesn't have access to the markets that the U.S. does, but does trade at 200 basis points over treasuries. Was 2.5% of GDP the right number, or should Panama, which also was very hard hit by the pandemic, should it have been a little more audacious in confronting the economic collapse?
Well, David, what do you want me to ask? Of course, we believe it's the right number. We had to go out to the markets. We were very successful in bond emissions, issuance that allow us to maneuver the COVID pandemic, not only in the health infrastructure, but also when we had to lock down and close commercial activities. Some of these funds were used to make money transfers for the people that were suspended in their labor contracts, and that also allowed them to have some sort of a demand. So the economy was working, lives were being saved, and the result is that last year, 2021, we ended up with a growth of 15.3%. So I'll have to say that, yeah, that was the right number.
And what are the forecasts for growth for this year and next?
It's around 6 to 7% growth this year.
And next year?
2022 and 2023 is about the same number, 6%.
Got it. When I lived in Venezuela, I had the pleasure of meeting and knowing well Teodoro Perkov, who was a very interesting politician and economic leader there. And he had a saying, he had a job not dissimilar to yours. He had a saying that it wasn't enough to save off Chavismo, he ran out of time, but he used to love to say that his expression was tanto mercado como sea posible, tanto Estado como sea necesario. As much free market as is possible, as much state presence as is necessary. What is your formula for this, Minister, and what is Panama's?
I tend to agree with that, but also I will add something. The collaboration between government and private sector has to be there. We need the private sector to grow. We need them to have the ability to create more companies and opportunities and create more jobs. And what I believe the government should do is to facilitate that in the best way possible. But also, as an example, last year we created a commission, public and private, and we, between the private sector and the public sector, issue some 38 actions to reactivate the economy. And it is not that they were making public policies, but they were helping us to visualize the correct public policies to implement and in order to reactivate the economy. So I agree with that, but also to have that constant communication between the private sector and the government is crucial.
Vanessa?
Perhaps I would only add that I agree with what Ramon just said, but I would say it's facilitate definitely, it's also regulate effectively, and it's also protect when necessary. because in countries like ours, emerging economies, developing economies, it is also very relevant to understand that you have extreme poverty, that you have people with lack of access to food, education, health, housing, services to housing, and you also need to provide for that. So as long as the state strikes this very difficult balance between enabling an environment for the private sector to flourish, also to regulate adequately the different sectors of the economy, but also protect the most vulnerable and especially the poor, I think that's the perfect balance in a state and in a government.
So related to this, Jorge, as I see protective barriers going up across the world on trade and other fronts, to this point, do I interpret this as some sort of knee-jerk populist erroneous response, or does some of it make sense?
Again, always think of populism as fear of the other. There's always the underlying theme of fear of the other. So you see, for instance, India implementing export controls on wheat. Well, that's fear of the outside world coming to take over your food supply.
What if India is legitimately running out of wheat?
And that could very well be the case. And that's going to start happening. I think we're going to start seeing a trend in many other countries implementing...
That is not a one-off isolate. We should not interpret that as a one-off event. That is just the beginning of...
The thing is, how do you play it politically? Do you play it within populist themes, or do you play it as a policy issue? There may be an argument to be made for food export controls, but there's a temptation of the populist messaging of implementing them precisely to protect the people from the outside, to protect the food going to feed others. So that's how you play it politically, and that's what populists are so good at. And that's what I'm afraid that these times, for these reasons, are just fertile ground for populists.
Right, you were saying that food migration, essentially food security is a growing driver of migration up, replacing something like security, which was in the past, correct?
Yes, I mean, we've seen food export controls in the past in other countries, even by populist governments, and I'll use the case of Kirchner in Argentina implementing or putting a tax on beef exports. But even though it's done by a populist leader, it's not necessarily done with a populist messaging. Right now, what you're seeing is populist messaging for these same policies. And again, that's a temptation. It's an easy win for the populist leaders, so the ground is fertile to use this type of messaging to get power and stay in power.
Got it. Now, Vanessa, so if I look across the region, I see over the last several months, I see Castillo winning in Peru, Boric winning in Chile, Petro potentially winning 2 weeks from now. And I wonder if this tilt to the left, it's in some ways perhaps a tilt to the populist left, are we just seeing the initial innings of a sea change coming, in part sparked by the pandemic, or are other dominoes to fall, as it were?
I don't think it's necessarily a result of the pandemic. I think it was exacerbated by the pandemic, but it was growing even before the pandemic. In the case of my country, Mexico, the current president campaigned for 18 years, no? So definitely something was brewing there before the pandemic, and I would say that that's the case in Chile. That's the case in Chile, that's the case in Ecuador, that's the case in Peru, that's the case in Mexico and in many other countries. And I would add up to what Jorge said, it is fear about the other, and that happens a lot in developed countries, but in the developing and the emerging world, it is more being against the other and defining us against the elite and defining us who have been abusing the system. So I also think that there's this very Manichaeist way of viewing the present, of viewing the narrative, and of course creating a very appealing rhetoric, no? That is very, very paradoxical in many ways. So I see this wave as being brewing before the pandemic, but being exacerbated by it.
And
So-
also,
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree completely. And the other thing that we have to be careful is young people are voting more, and perhaps it's more difficult for them to understand what is the change, what am I changing? It's like I need a change, but that sort of speech is really hurting all the countries. And that's why I was telling you, if we can incorporate young people into decision, into participating, into giving ideas, perhaps it's a way to also control or contain that threat.
Got it. What I haven't gleaned from you guys is if Petro's winning in 2 weeks or not, but I guess we shall see soon enough. Now, I have a great question from the audience, which I appreciate very much because it brought me to a question I had here and I had forgotten to ask him. I'm going to put the question to Jorge. So the question effectively gets at the role of social media and populism and interplay there. And I do reflect back on a piece. The Atlantic had an outstanding cover story a year or two ago, and it talked about the mob in our hands, right? That if Madison, 200 some odd years ago, was always terrified of the mob and how the mob was going to lead us to horrible policy choices and all that. That didn't really play out then. But now we have these mobs. We live 24/7 with mobs in our hands. We're always worked up and riled up. So in that being the case, is populism, are we just doomed to a populist future, given how we're always constantly riled up and worked up and outraged?
Everybody who studies populism says that in order to fix that problem or to address that problem, you have to address social media along the way. So the answer is yes, we are doomed unless you address social media. And by social media, I mean algorithms. It's not just the fact that it helps them suck all the oxygen out of a conversation because a populist always has the biggest megaphone, but because the way the algorithms are set right now, you have cases, as would be the case with Facebook, YouTube, and others, it's a feeding loop of itself, of the fear or whatever it is that they're trying to promote. So that again is fertile ground for populists. So yes, in order to address populism, evidently you have to address social media.
Vanessa?
If I may add, I think social media, if we understand populism, we need to understand social media as a platform that made populism in some way possible, because it gave the possibility of people expressing their frustration, expressing their anger. The fact that social media has been used and abused by populist leaders affecting democracies, and by populist leaders affecting and authoritarians affecting elections, for instance. But also one thing that worries me a lot about social media is the blunt lies and the post-factual society. Everyone is entitled to its own views and to its own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own data, to your own facts, and to your own truth. And that is something that we need to deal with in the context of social media.
And are you seeing any signs that governments are effectively starting to deal with it or not?
I think there's a trend of how to regulate social media, how to regulate it appropriately, this deplatforming and these new context of how do you engage in fiscal policy for social media? How do you make them more accountable? How do you deal with social media in the middle of the elections and violence against women, very specific in the context of elections? So I think there's a trend of several attempts to regulate and regulate better, but it has to be something that needs to be done between the government, between the private sector, of course the social media owners themselves, and the society. Transparency and accountability.
Okay. Last question before I read we wrap up for the day and I read our list of things to do for the rest of the night, is tangentially related to our topic here, but it came up earlier today where there was talk about that we are in the early stages of our next commodity super cycle, which isn't exactly a populist thing. But I know, Jorge, you think that's nonsense.
I think that's nonsense.
Tell the room why you think that is nonsense.
I think, so that was a different conversation that Dave and I were having. And we're talking about just world issues, and I just see a Chinese slowdown for the foreseeable future, and by foreseeable future I mean 10 to 20 years of China growing to 2 to 3% a year at best, and just implicitly, since China is the biggest market for commodities, that will bring down.
There is no scenario in which you can have a low growth China and a super cycle. These things cannot happen simultaneously.
My thesis is that no, there is no super cycle without China as the main market for. There's nobody to substitute China's hunger for.
So basically, everyone should go out and short oil now. Right?
Well, that's my thesis anyway.
There we go. Short oil. That's what Jorge says. Okay, I believe we are wrapped for the. I appreciate. Thank you very much to all three of you. I do have a list of things.